The amber light of kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across the smoke-filled interior of Murphy's saloon, where the acrid smell of tobacco and whiskey hung heavy in the air like a suffocating blanket. Outside, the wind howled through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a forgotten town clinging to life in the harsh Wyoming territory. The wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of desperate men seeking escape from their failures in cards, drink, or both. Rose Harper sat rigid in a corner chair, her calloused hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the poker game that would determine her fate. At 23, she had learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung limp and unwashed around her shoulders. Her dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days, bore the stains of countless tears and the grime of a life lived without choice. "Your call, Garrett," said Tom Bradley, the saloon owner whose meaty fingers drummed impatiently on the scarred wooden table. His voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to owning everything he touched, including the woman who had served his establishment for the past 2 years. Jake Garrett, a cattle rustler with a reputation for violence, studied his cards through bloodshot eyes. His weathered face, marked by a jagged scar running from his left ear to his chin, twisted into a cruel smile. "Well now, Bradley, seems I'm a bit short on cash tonight." He gestured toward Rose without looking at her. "But I reckon that girl there might cover my bet." Rose's stomach churned, but she remained motionless. She had learned long ago that resistance only brought more pain. Her father had sold her to Bradley 2 years ago to cover his gambling debts, and now Bradley was prepared to trade her away just as carelessly. In this world, women like her were currency, nothing more, nothing less. "She's worth more than your measly $10, Bradley said, his eyes glinting with the same avarice that had made him wealthy in this godforsaken town. "But I suppose she'll do. Been nothing but trouble lately anyway, asking for wages like she's some kind of free woman." The other players at the table, a traveling merchant and 2 local ranch hands, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. In Redemption Creek, a man's business was his own, no matter how ugly it became. Garrett's laugh was harsh and grating. "Trouble, you say? Well, I know how to handle troublesome women. My last wife learned real quick to keep her mouth shut." His hand instinctively moved to the handle of the knife at his belt, and Rose felt ice in her veins. She closed her eyes and tried to transport herself somewhere else, anywhere else. She thought of her mother, who had died when Rose was 15, leaving her with nothing but memories of gentle hands braiding her hair and a voice singing lullabies. Her mother had dreamed of Rose finding a good man, having children, living a life of dignity. Those dreams now seemed as distant as the stars. The saloon doors suddenly burst open with such force that they slammed against the walls, causing several patrons to spill their drinks. A tall figure stepped through the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the pale moonlight. The man was imposing, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his worn leather coat. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his face bore the hard lines of a man who had seen too much of life's cruelty. Daniel McCall's presence seemed to suck the air from the room. His steel-gray eyes swept across the saloon, taking in every detail with the calculating gaze of a predator. When his attention settled on the poker table, his expression darkened. In his right hand, he carried a Colt .45, not drawn but ready, a warning to anyone foolish enough to test him. "Evening, gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart men step aside. "Heard there was an interesting game going on in here." Bradley's face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. Everyone in the territory knew Daniel McCall by reputation, a rancher who had built his spread with hard work and harder choices. Rumors followed him like shadows, stories of gunfights, of men who had crossed him and disappeared into the unforgiving wilderness. "Mr. McCall," Bradley said carefully, "just a friendly game of poker. Nothing that concerns you." Daniel's eyes found Rose, and for a moment, something flickered across his features. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of suffering. She looked back at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, though she dared not speak. "Seems to me," Daniel said, his voice growing colder, "that what you're wagering isn't yours to bet." He took a step closer to the table, and every man present could feel the tension ratchet up another notch. Garrett's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when Daniel's weapon shifted almost imperceptibly in his direction. "Now see here, McCall. This is none of your business. The girl belongs to Bradley fair and square." "Belongs?" Daniel repeated, the word dripping with disgust. "I've seen cattle treated better than that woman." His gaze returned to Rose, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't quite identify. Was it compassion, or something darker? "She owes me money," Bradley protested, sweat beading on his forehead. "Her father's debts." "How much?" Daniel interrupted. The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Bradley glanced around the table, calculating. $50. Plus interest. Call it 75 all told. Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. He counted out the money slowly, deliberately, each coin hitting the table with a metallic clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "There's your 75. The woman comes with me." "Now wait just a minute." Garrett started to rise from his chair, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. The Colt appeared in Daniel's hands so quickly it seemed like magic, the barrel pointed directly at Garrett's chest. "I'd think real careful about your next move, friend." Garrett froze, his eyes fixed on the unwavering gun barrel. Around the saloon, other patrons slowly began to back away, sensing violence in the air like the charge before a lightning strike. "The lady is free to go," Daniel said, his voice now carrying the finality of a judge's sentence. "Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me outside." Rose stood on trembling legs, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Was this man truly offering her freedom, or was he simply another buyer in a different market? His face revealed nothing of his intentions, only a grim determination that both terrified and reassured her. "You're making a mistake, McCall," Bradley said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "That girl will bring you nothing but trouble." Daniel's smile was cold as winter wind. "Mister, I've been dealing with trouble my whole life. I reckon I can handle one more piece of it." As Rose walked toward the door, her legs barely supporting her weight, she felt the eyes of every man in the saloon following her. Some looked at her with pity, others with the calculating gaze of men wondering if they could afford Daniel McCall's price. But it was Daniel's expression that puzzled her most. There was no kindness there, no gentle rescue. Instead, she saw a man driven by demons she couldn't yet understand. The night air hit her face like a blessing as they stepped outside, the clean scent of sagebrush a welcome relief from the stale atmosphere of the saloon. Daniel holstered his weapon and looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now but still guarded. "Rose," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Rose Harper." He nodded once, curtly. "Well, Rose Harper, I hope you can work, because I didn't pay $75 for decoration. My ranch needs hands, and you'll earn your keep like everyone else." The harsh words stung, but Rose felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of dignity through honest labor. Whatever Daniel McCall's motives, whatever darkness drove him, he had given her something no one else had offered, a chance to work for her freedom rather than simply be owned by it. As they walked toward his horse, Rose caught a glimpse of his profile in the moonlight. There was pain etched in the lines around his eyes, a sorrow that seemed to match her own. Perhaps, she thought, they were both running from ghosts that could only be faced together. The last thing she heard as they rode away from Redemption Creek was the angry voices spilling from Murphy's saloon, but for the first time in 2 years, Rose Harper was heading toward an uncertain future that was entirely her own to shape. The McCall Ranch materialized from the pre-dawn darkness like something from a fever dream, its weathered buildings silhouetted against the vast Wyoming sky. Rose had dozed fitfully during the 3-hour ride, her body pressed against Daniel's back out of necessity rather than comfort. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he held himself rigid as if contact with another human being caused him physical pain. As they approached the main house, Rose took in her new surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading every detail of her environment. The ranch was substantial but clearly neglected, fences in need of repair, a barn with loose boards, and corrals that spoke of better days. The house itself was a sturdy two-story structure, built to withstand the harsh winters and violent storms that swept across the territory, but even in the dim light, she could see the signs of a home that had lost its heart. "You'll sleep in the bunkhouse," Daniel said as he dismounted, his voice cutting through the morning silence. "There's an empty room at the end. Door has a lock." He paused, his eyes finding hers in the growing light. "Use it." The implication behind his words was clear, and Rose felt a mixture of gratitude and wariness. This man had saved her from Jake Garrett's brutal hands, but his motives remained as mysterious as the shadows that seemed to follow him. Daniel led her to a long, low building that housed the ranch hands. The wooden structure was basic but clean, with a stone chimney that promised warmth during the brutal winter months. As they walked past the other doors, Rose could hear the soft snores and restless movements of sleeping men. "This is yours," Daniel said, pushing open a door at the far end. The room was small but private, containing a narrow bed with clean sheets, a washstand, and a wooden chest for belongings she didn't have. A single window looked out toward the mountains, where the first hints of sunrise were painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Rose stepped inside, her calloused hands running over the rough wooden walls. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first space she had been able to call her own since leaving her father's house. "Breakfast is at 5:30, Daniel continued, his voice businesslike. "Work starts at 6. Maria handles the cooking, but she'll expect help in the kitchen when the day's work is done. Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir," Rose replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can cook, clean men's clothes. I've been doing it for years." Something flickered across Daniel's features. Was it sympathy, or simply acknowledgement of her utility? "Good. The men will test you. They'll push to see how far they can go. You stand your ground, but you don't start fights you can't finish." "Understood." Rose nodded, though the weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had traded one form of survival for another, and the rules were still being written by men who held all the power. "One more thing," Daniel said, his hand resting on the doorframe. "I paid $75 for your freedom from Bradley, not for you. That money comes out of your wages until it's paid back. After that, you're free to stay or go as you choose." The words hit Rose like a physical blow. She had thought, hoped, that his intervention at the saloon had been motivated by some form of compassion. Instead, she was simply in debt to a different master, bound by financial chains rather than legal ones. "How much are wages?" she asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. $1 a day, plus room and board," Daniel replied. "Same as the other hands." Rose quickly calculated in her head. At that rate, it would take her nearly 3 months to repay the debt, assuming she could manage to avoid any additional expenses. 3 months of uncertainty, of not knowing whether Daniel McCall was truly different from the other men who had controlled her life. "That's fair," she said finally, though fairness seemed like a luxury she had never been able to afford. Daniel studied her face in the growing light, and Rose found herself meeting his gaze despite every instinct that told her to look away. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, holding depths of pain that seemed to echo her own experiences. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This ranch, it's not an easy place. The land is hard, the work is harder, and the winters can break a person's spirit. Some of the men who work here are running from things they can't face. Others are just trying to survive. You'll need to figure out which category you fall into." Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Which category do you fall into, Mr. McCall?" For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of raw anguish that took her breath away. "Both," he said simply, then turned and walked away, leaving Rose alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that she had traded one form of captivity for another, more complex bondage. As the sun rose higher, Rose could hear the ranch coming to life around her. Boots on wooden floors, the low murmur of men's voices, the distant lowing of cattle. She washed her face in the basin, braided her hair back severely, and prepared to face whatever challenges this new life would bring. When she emerged from her room, she found the other ranch hands gathered around a long wooden table in what served as a communal dining area. 5 men of various ages, all bearing the weathered look of men who worked under the merciless western sun. Their conversation died as she entered, and Rose felt the weight of their collective scrutiny. "Well, well," said a grizzled man with silver whiskers and knowing eyes. "You must be the Lady Danny pulled out of Murphy's last night." His voice carried a hint of amusement, but also something else, respect, perhaps, or simple human decency. "This is Pete Hawkins," Daniel said, appearing behind Rose with a cup of coffee in his hands. "He's my foreman, and he'll show you what needs doing." Pete stood and extended a weathered hand. "Ma'am, welcome to the McCall Ranch. Can't say it's much to look at, but it's honest work." Rose shook his hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in his grip. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I'm Rose Harper, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." The other men introduced themselves with varying degrees of friendliness. Jim Bradley, a young cowhand with eager eyes. Carlos Mendez, a quiet man who nodded respectfully. Tom Walsh, middle-aged with careful, measuring looks. And Buck Morrison, whose hostile stare made Rose's skin crawl. "Don't see why we need some saloon girl making trouble around here," Buck muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Got enough problems without adding petticoats to the mix." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Daniel's coffee cup hit the table with a sharp crack that made everyone jump. "Miss Harper is here to work, same as the rest of you," Daniel said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Anyone who has a problem with that can collect his pay and ride out. Today." Buck's face flushed red, but he had enough sense to keep his mouth shut. The tension stretched like a taut wire until Pete cleared his throat and began discussing the day's tasks. As Rose helped Maria, the ranch cook, prepare breakfast, she found herself stealing glances at Daniel. He sat apart from the other men, eating in silence while his eyes constantly scanned the room as if expecting trouble. There was something almost military about his bearing, a hypervigilance that spoke of experiences that had taught him to trust no one completely. "He's a good man," Maria said quietly, following Rose's gaze. The older Mexican woman had kind eyes and gentle hands scarred by years of kitchen work. "Troubled, yes, but good. He saved my son from a beating in town last year, gave my family work when no one else would." "Why?" Rose asked. "Why does he help people?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her hands working methodically as she prepared tortillas for the noon meal. "I think maybe he's trying to save something in himself," she said finally. "Something he lost a long time ago." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Rose found herself assigned to help with the horses, a task that both terrified and exhilarated her. She had never worked closely with such large, powerful animals, but Pete proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to approach them with confidence and respect. "Horses can sense fear," he explained as Rose nervously approached a gentle mare named Stella. "But they can also sense kindness. You treat them right and they'll take care of you." As Rose's hands learned the rhythm of brushing and caring for the animals, she began to understand why men like Pete chose this hard life. There was something pure about the work, something that connected her to the land and the creatures that depended on human care for their survival. It was during the midday break that Rose first glimpsed the depths of Daniel's hidden pain. She had gone to the well for water when she heard the sound of splintering wood coming from behind the barn. Curious despite her better judgment, she crept around the corner and saw Daniel attacking a pile of broken fence posts with an axe, his movements violent and desperate. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his face contorted with an anguish so raw it made Rose's chest tighten with sympathy. With each swing of the axe, he seemed to be fighting demons that only he could see. She watched, transfixed, as this controlled, dangerous man revealed the broken soul beneath his carefully constructed exterior. "Sarah," she heard him whisper between swings. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so goddamn sorry." Rose backed away quietly, her heart pounding with the realization that Daniel McCall was not her savior. He was simply another lost soul seeking redemption in the harsh beauty of the frontier. And perhaps, she thought as she returned to work, that made him exactly the right person to understand her own desperate need for a second chance. 3 weeks had passed since Rose's arrival at the McCall Ranch, and the rhythm of hard work had begun to weave itself into her bones. Her hands, already calloused from years of servitude, had grown stronger from handling ropes and reins. The morning air no longer felt like a punishment against her skin but rather a promise of another day where she could earn her freedom $1 at a time. The autumn winds had begun to carry the bite of approaching winter, stripping the leaves from the cottonwoods that lined the creek running through the property. Rose had learned to read the subtle changes in weather that could mean the difference between a successful day and disaster on the frontier. More importantly, she had begun to read the complex dynamics of the men she worked alongside. Pete Hawkins had become something of a father figure, patient with her mistakes and generous with his knowledge of ranch life. Jim Bradley, despite his youth, treated her with the kind of respectful distance that spoke well of his upbringing. Carlos Mendez had warmed to her gradually, especially after she had helped his wife with a difficult birth in town, demonstrating skills learned from years of caring for others. Even Tom Walsh had begun to nod acknowledgments when their paths crossed. Buck Morrison remained a problem. The man's hostility had only grown as Rose proved herself capable of the work. His comments had become increasingly crude, his accidental touches more frequent, and his challenges to her presence more direct. Daniel seemed oblivious to the escalating tension, consumed as he was by whatever demons drove him to work from before dawn until well after dark. It was on a particularly bitter morning that everything came to a head. Rose was in the barn, tending to a horse with a suspected stone bruise, when Buck cornered her. The smell of whiskey on his breath told her he had been drinking since the previous night, and the wild look in his eyes warned her that his usual restraint had abandoned him entirely. "Think you're something special, don't you?" he slurred, blocking her path to the barn door. "Got old Danny wrapped around your finger, making the rest of us look bad." Rose kept her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Morrison. Same as everyone else." "Your job?" he laughed harshly. "Your job is being on your back, and everyone knows it. You think any of us believe McCall paid $75 for a ranch hand?" The words hit Rose like physical blows, not because they were unexpected, but because she had heard similar accusations whispered behind her back for weeks. The other men had been too respectful to voice their suspicions directly, but Buck had no such compunctions. "Mr. McCall has been nothing but proper," Rose said, trying to step around him. "And I've given no one any reason to think otherwise." Buck's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "Maybe it's time you started earning your keep the way women like you are supposed to." Rose's survival instincts, honed by years of avoiding dangerous men, screamed at her to submit, to avoid escalating the situation. But something deeper, a spark of the dignity she had thought lost forever, flared to life in her chest. "Let go of me," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "Or what?" Buck leered, his grip tightening. "You'll tell teacher? McCall's got his own troubles to worry about. Word is his precious family got themselves killed because he couldn't protect them. What makes you think he'll protect you?" The mention of Daniel's family sent a shock through Rose. She had suspected he carried the weight of loss, but to hear it confirmed, especially in Buck's cruel words, filled her with an unexpected rage on Daniel's behalf. "You don't know anything about him," she said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Buck's laugh was ugly. "I know he's been drinking himself to sleep every night since you got here. I know he talks to ghosts. And I know that if you were smart, you'd choose a protector who isn't half crazy with grief." His other hand reached for her face, and Rose reacted without thinking. Years of repressed anger and humiliation exploded outward as she brought her knee up hard between Buck's legs. He doubled over with a howl of pain and rage, releasing her wrist as his hands instinctively protected his injured anatomy. Rose ran for the barn door, but Buck's shout of "You little whore" followed her into the morning air. She collided with Pete Hawkins, who was approaching the barn with a worried expression. "What in tarnation?" Pete began, but his words were cut off by the sight of Buck stumbling from the barn, his face twisted with pain and fury. "That bitch attacked me," Buck snarled, pointing an accusatory finger at Rose. "Came at me like a wildcat for no reason." Pete's experienced eyes took in Rose's torn sleeve, her frightened but defiant expression, and Buck's disheveled appearance. The older man's face darkened with understanding and disgust. "Buck Morrison, you lying piece of... What's going on here?" Daniel's voice cut through the confrontation like a blade through silk. He stood 20 feet away, but his presence filled the space between them with an almost palpable tension. His gray eyes moved from Rose's frightened face to Buck's belligerent stance, and Rose saw something shift in his expression, a coldness that made her previous fears of him seem childish. "This woman attacked me," Buck said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction under Daniel's stare. "Unprovoked. I was just..." "You were just what?" Daniel asked, his voice deceptively quiet as he walked closer. Rose noticed that his hand rested casually near his gun, and she remembered the deadly speed with which he had drawn it in the saloon. "Buck's lying, boss," Pete said firmly. "I've seen his type before. Rose here's got torn clothing and the look of a woman who's been handled rough. Buck's got the look of a man who got what he deserved." Daniel's attention focused on Rose, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see directed at her: protective fury. "Did he hurt you?" Rose looked at Buck, who was watching her with barely concealed menace, and then at Pete, whose kind face offered encouragement. Finally, her gaze settled on Daniel, and she saw not just anger but something deeper, a recognition of her pain that came from intimate familiarity with suffering. "He grabbed me," she said quietly. He said things. About you. About me. About why you really brought me here." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Buck's face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the finality of a judge passing sentence. "Get your things. You're done here." Buck's face flushed red. "Now see here, McCall. I've worked this spread for 2 years. You can't just..." "I can and I am." Daniel's hand moved to rest on his gun, but a gesture so casual it was terrifying. "You've got 10 minutes to clear out before I decide that talking to my employees the way you talk to Miss Harper requires a more permanent solution." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Buck looked around desperately, seeking support from the other men who had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. But even Tom Walsh, who had shown Rose the least warmth, shook his head in disgust. "You heard the boss," Pete said firmly. "Get moving." As Buck stalked away toward the bunkhouse, muttering curses and threats, Daniel turned his attention back to Rose. The cold fury in his expression softened slightly, replaced by something that might have been concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Rose shook her head, though her wrists still throbbed where Buck had grabbed her. "I'm fine. Just shaken." "Pete, see that Miss Harper gets whatever she needs. And make sure Morrison understands that if I see him on my land again, we'll have a different kind of conversation." As Daniel turned to leave, Rose found herself calling after him. "Mr. McCall?" He paused, looking back at her with those storm cloud eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, curtly, but Rose caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his expression before he walked away. As she watched him go, she realized that the dangerous man who had rescued her from the saloon and the broken soul she had glimpsed behind the barn were the same person, a man carrying guilt and grief that threatened to destroy him. That evening, as Rose helped Maria prepare dinner, the older woman shared what she knew of Daniel's story. "He had a wife," Maria said quietly, her hands working steadily as she prepared masa for tortillas. "Sarah. Beautiful girl, gentle as spring rain. They were married maybe 3 years when the trouble started." Rose found herself leaning closer, hungry for understanding of the man who had become the center of her uncertain world. "There was a dispute over water rights," Maria continued. "Some men from back east wanted to buy up all the ranches in the valley. When the local ranchers refused to sell, these men decided to make examples." Rose's stomach tightened with dread, sensing tragedy in Maria's careful words. "They came at night," Maria whispered. "Set fire to the house while Daniel was away checking the north pasture. Sarah and their little boy, Tommy." She crossed herself, unable to finish the sentence. Rose felt tears burning her eyes as the pieces of Daniel's broken life fell into place. The carefully controlled violence, The isolation, the way he flinched from human contact, all of it made terrible sense now. "He blames himself," Maria said. "Says he should have been there, should have protected them. The men who did it, they disappeared back east where the law couldn't touch them. Daniel, he tried to follow, tried to find justice, but..." She shrugged sadly. "Some wounds, they never heal right." That night, Rose lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl across the plains and thinking about the complex man who had given her a chance at freedom. She understood now why he had intervened at the saloon, not out of kindness for her, but from his own desperate need to save someone when he had failed to save the people who mattered most. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Rose made a silent promise to herself and to the ghosts that haunted the McCall ranch. She would prove worthy of Daniel's investment, not just by paying back the money he had spent, but by showing him that some people could still be saved, that redemption was possible even in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the frontier. Outside her window, she could hear the soft sound of footsteps on the porch of the main house, and she knew that Daniel McCall was walking his nightly vigil, keeping watch over a world that had already taken everything he loved. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that caught even the most seasoned ranchers off guard. The first blizzard struck in late November, transforming the McCall ranch into a white wasteland where survival depended on preparation, determination, and the bonds forged between people who had learned to depend on each other. Rose had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and the $75 debt that had bound her to Daniel McCall was down to $15. More importantly, she had begun to feel something she had never experienced before: the satisfaction of honest work and the gradual building of trust with the people around her. The men who had initially viewed her with suspicion now treated her as a valued member of the crew, and even Maria had begun to rely on her help with the more demanding aspects of feeding a ranch full of hungry workers. But it was her evolving relationship with Daniel that occupied most of her thoughts during the long winter evenings. Since Buck Morrison's departure, Daniel had made subtle changes in how he interacted with Rose. He no longer avoided her completely, sometimes joining the evening conversations by the fire in the bunkhouse common room. He had even begun to ask for her opinion on ranch matters, treating her insights with the same respect he showed Pete and the other experienced hands. Yet Rose could see that the approaching anniversary of his family's death was taking its toll on him. His drinking had increased, and the controlled facade he presented to the world showed cracks that worried everyone who cared about him. It was during the worst storm of the season that everything changed. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, with winds so fierce they threatened to tear the roof from the buildings. The ranch hands huddled in the bunkhouse, taking turns checking on the livestock and maintaining the fires that kept them all from freezing to death. Outside, the world had disappeared into a swirling white void that made travel between buildings dangerous and potentially fatal. Rose was helping Maria prepare what might be their last hot meal for days when Pete burst through the kitchen door, his face grim with worry. "We got problems," he announced, shaking snow from his coat. "Some of the cattle broke through the north fence and scattered into the canyon. If we don't get them back before this storm breaks, we'll lose half the herd to wolves or cold." The financial implications were staggering. The cattle represented Daniel's entire livelihood, the foundation upon which the ranch's survival depended. Losing them would mean bankruptcy, the end of everything he had built from the ashes of his personal tragedy. "Where's Daniel?" Pete asked, looking around the kitchen. Rose and Maria exchanged worried glances. They both knew where Daniel was, locked in his room with a bottle of whiskey, wrestling with demons that had grown stronger as the anniversary of Sarah and Tommy's death approached. "I'll get him," Rose said, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. Pete shook his head. "Miss Rose, he's been drinking pretty heavy. Might not be in a mood to listen to reason." "Then someone needs to make him listen," Rose replied, already moving toward the door. "Those cattle won't save themselves." The journey from the kitchen to the main house took her through wind and snow that seemed determined to strip the flesh from her bones. By the time she reached Daniel's front door, her hands were numb with cold and her lungs burned from breathing the icy air. She found Daniel in what had once been the family parlor, slouched in a leather chair with an empty bottle on the table beside him. The room bore the faded elegance of happier times. a woman's touch evident in the carefully chosen furniture and the photographs that Daniel couldn't bring himself to remove or bear to look at. "Daniel," Rose said softly, approaching him as she might approach a wounded animal. He looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold all the pain in the world. His dark hair was disheveled, his face unshaven, and his clothing bore the stains of spilled whiskey and neglect. "Rose," he said, her name slurring slightly. "Come to check on the crazy man?" "I came to tell you that your cattle are scattered in the North Canyon," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the storm of emotions his appearance stirred in her. "Pete says if we don't get them back soon, you'll lose everything." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Everything? I lost everything 3 years ago. The cattle, the ranch, all of it, it's just noise now." Rose felt anger flare in her chest, not at Daniel's pain, but at his willingness to surrender to it. "So you're going to let them die? Let all the men who depend on you lose their jobs because you're too wrapped up in your own grief to see what's right in front of you?" Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on her with dangerous intensity. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Rose stepped closer, her fear overwhelmed by righteous fury. "I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it feels like to have your choices taken away, to be treated like you don't matter. But I also know what it's like to be given a second chance." She gestured toward the photographs on the mantel, images of Sarah and Tommy frozen in happier times. "Do you think your wife would want this? Do you think she'd want you to destroy everything you built together because you couldn't save her?" Daniel surged to his feet, swaying slightly but radiating menace. "Don't you dare talk about Sarah. You don't know." "I know she loved you," Rose interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. "I know she trusted you to build something good in this hard place. And I know that if you let those cattle die, if you let this ranch fail, then the men who killed her win. They destroy everything she cared about, even 3 years later." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Rose saw the moment when they hit their mark. Daniel's face crumpled, the carefully constructed walls around his grief collapsing under the weight of truth. "I couldn't protect them," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his soul. "I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to keep them safe." Rose's anger transformed into compassion as she watched this strong, dangerous man reveal the broken child inside. "You can't protect everyone from everything," she said gently. "But you can honor their memory by protecting what they would have wanted you to protect." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, seeming to see her clearly for the first time. "Why do you care? About the ranch, about me? You could walk away. Your debt's almost paid." Rose considered the question, searching for words to explain feelings she was only beginning to understand herself. "Because you saved me when you didn't have to. Because this place has become home in a way nowhere else ever was. And because..." She paused, gathering courage for the most honest words she had ever spoken. "Because someone needs to believe you're worth saving." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the howling wind outside. Finally, Daniel straightened, and Rose saw a glimpse of the man he had been before tragedy broke him. "Help me get my coat," he said simply. The rescue operation that followed tested every skill Rose had learned during her months at the ranch. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, and the temperature was so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But Daniel, sobered by purpose and responsibility, proved why he had earned the respect of every rancher in the territory. He led the search party with the instincts of a man who knew every inch of his land, finding the scattered cattle by reading signs that were invisible to Rose's untrained eyes. Pete and the other hands worked with the efficiency of men who trusted their leader completely, despite having seen him at his lowest point. Rose's job was to help drive the cattle back through the narrow canyon pass, a task that required her to overcome her fear of the massive animals and the treacherous footing. When one young steer became separated from the herd and threatened to disappear into the storm, it was Rose who risked her life to pursue it, following Daniel's shouted instructions and trusting in the skills he had taught her. The rescue took nearly 8 hours, and by the time they drove the last of the cattle into the protected valley near the ranch buildings, all of them were exhausted and half frozen. But they had saved the herd, and with it, the ranch's future. As the men celebrated their success with hot coffee laced with whiskey, Daniel pulled Rose aside. In the lamplight of the barn, she could see that something fundamental had changed in his expression. The despair that had haunted his eyes for months had been replaced by something she hadn't dared hope for: peace. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion and cold. "Not just for today, but for reminding me who I used to be." Rose felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she looked up at this man who had become so much more than her reluctant rescuer. "Who were you?" Daniel's smile was sad but genuine. Someone who believed that good people deserved protection. Someone who thought that building something worthwhile was worth the pain it cost. "You still are that person," Rose said firmly. "You just forgot for a while." As the weeks passed and winter gradually loosened its grip on the territory, Rose watched Daniel rebuild himself with the same methodical care he brought to repairing the ranch. He cut back on his drinking, resumed taking meals with the hands, and began planning improvements for the coming spring. More importantly, he began to treat Rose not as an indentured servant working off a debt, but as a partner in the enterprise of making the ranch successful. He sought her opinions on everything from which crops to plant to how to improve relations with the neighboring spreads. It was during one of these planning sessions, held in the kitchen while Maria prepared dinner, that Daniel made an announcement that changed everything. "I've been thinking about your situation, Rose," he said, looking up from the ledger books they had been reviewing. "Your debt's been paid for weeks now, but you're still here." Rose felt her heart skip a beat. Was he telling her to leave? Had she misread the growing warmth between them? "I'd like to make you a formal offer," Daniel continued. "Equal partnership in the ranch. Your name on the deed, your voice in all decisions. What do you say?" The offer took Rose's breath away. In 1875, women rarely owned property, and the idea of true partnership with a man was almost unheard of. But as she looked into Daniel's eyes, she saw not charity or pity, but respect for what she had proven herself capable of. "Why?" she asked, echoing the question he had posed to her months earlier. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Because you saved my life just as surely as I saved yours. Because this place needs both of us to survive. And because..." He paused, color rising in his cheeks. "Because I've come to care about you in ways I never expected to feel again." Rose felt her own cheeks warm with a blush that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. "Daniel, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said quickly. "I'm just asking you to stay. To help me build something Sarah would be proud of. Something that honors what we've both lost and what we've found together." Rose looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of her new life, at Maria, who had become like a mother to her, at the ledger books that represented honest work and fair wages, at the man who had shown her that redemption was possible even in the harshest places. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll stay." As spring returned to the Wyoming territory, bringing new life to the land and new hope to the people who called it home, Rose Harper and Daniel McCall began the slow, careful work of building a life together. They faced the challenges that came with their unconventional partnership, the gossip of neighbors, the disapproval of some townspeople, the practical difficulties of two wounded souls learning to trust again. But they faced them together as equals, in a place where the only thing that mattered was the strength to endure and the courage to keep building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. The McCall Ranch prospered under their joint leadership, becoming known throughout the territory as a place where hard work was rewarded, where people were judged by their character rather than their history, and where two people who had lost everything found a way to create something worth having. And if sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the work was done, Rose would catch Daniel looking at Sarah's photograph with sadness rather than despair, she understood that some loves never die. They simply make room for new ones to grow alongside them, stronger for the understanding that nothing in life is guaranteed except the choices we make with the time we're given. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The end.